Hunting has always been about preserving nature, and innovations like thermals can make hunting even more sustainable. Henrik Sproedt, ProStar Fucon Advanced Optics Worldwide, now discusses how thermal optics increase sustainability. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, welcome to the presentation. I'm glad to be here. I hope you understand me well. We're talking about sustainability and how that can be increased or improved by thermal devices. Let's start with the idea of sustainability. The birthplace of sustainability is actually hunting and forestry, because that's two things, two activities where you need to work sustainably, otherwise you kill the basis of your enterprise, right? So in German, in the German language, you have the term Hege. Hege basically, in the language of professional hunting, means that we want to protect the nature and the wildlife in order to increase the highest number or the biggest quantity of biological diversity. Hege and hunting in Germany are actually imperative. You cannot separate both. If you are hunting, you're obliged to engage in Hege, in the sustainable management of wildlife. Hunters invest 128 million euros voluntarily in this field in Germany alone, not even talking about the whole EU, where we have similar setups of hunting. Of course, a part of hunting is pest control, it's pandemic prevention, crop protection, and all this is a part of hunting. It's not what we think of immediately when we think about hunting, but that is a central element of this. We want to, as hunters, we want to be able to have that influence to keep the environment and the wildlife out there thriving, and that sometimes means that we have to regulate a little bit as we live in a society coined by people. There's cultural influences, so we have to help a little bit there. So in all this, how does technology actually fit in there? Okay, to approach that topic, we're going to talk about the tech challenge that's connected to that, because it's not just like, hey, there's something new, let's use it. We also need to know how. We have to ask ourselves, is night hunting actually ethical? I mean, are we okay with that? That's something that we weren't able to do for a long time, because as humans, we're more or less blind during the night. Then thermal optics, how do they actually make hunting more ethical? And, well, when is that not the case? And also, how could it be ethical without thermal? So there are several challenges we want to address in this little presentation here. Sustainability, let's start from the beginning. Sustainability basically means the ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level, preferably by the system we're talking about itself. And, well, there we go. When we get to the tech challenge, we have several issues we need to talk about. While technology enables us to do much more than we could do just with our human abilities, there is something that comes into play which is, like a soft value. What about responsibility? How do we use technology? That is the big question. And how high do we hang our values, and how much do we let greed take over? Because new possibilities also, it's hard to keep the balance. If we suddenly are able to do more, we might also need to limit ourselves sometimes. So we need to understand the background of what's going on there. That means we need to understand and learn what's actually happening out there, because now with thermal technology, night vision in general, we can suddenly see what's going on. We learn to understand the unseen. That is interesting because it requires us to start learning almost from the beginning in a new context. If we're talking about hunting, we're talking about harvesting wildlife selectively, mainly with the purpose of gathering food and maintaining biodiversity. We are not talking about slaughtering, which in itself is an honorable craft, but it's basically turning livestock into food, right? So On the other hand, we also have eradicating, killing with the purpose of eradicating a population which has nothing to do with hunting in the first place, but then again we have new species which are not really at home in the environments where they're living, and that creates sometimes the need to fight those heavily in order to protect the local biodiversity. So hunting as a part of nature is something that has always been coined by innovation, because in the past, like very, very far back, success meant surviving, failure meant dying. So yes, we wanted to change, we wanted to learn. So we wanted to always create, as hunters, a deeper knowledge and a deeper understanding, not because we were greedy, but very much also because we have a deep respect for the wildlife out there, for nature in general. Okay, so that's the scene, the stage, how we set it. Now the ethics come into play. Ethics, as most of us know, are moral principles that govern our behavior or conduct in a certain way, often coined by the environment we grew up in. So is night hunting an ethical dilemma? So is it actually ethical to develop further more and more technology, doing things, being able to do things that we were not by nature? So that's a good question, I think. How much tech is ethical? Because no matter whether we use thermal or not, we use tech. Is a scope ethical? Is a red dot ethical? Yeah, I think it can be if we use it in the right way. So putting food on the table or keeping a pandemic away is another question where we are challenged to ask ourselves how much ethics do we afford ourselves, right? To really boil it down, it's often very easy to make some ethical claims, but it's very difficult to live up to your own standards, so to say. And what about the evolution and adaptation, not only of us, but also of our environment? Also, wildlife is changing and subject to evolution. They change their patterns of behavior, so we need to adapt to that as well. So the question in that context, from an ethical perspective, is it actually more ethical to not hunt during the night because we cannot see anything and rather hunt those species that are night active during daytime where they should actually rest? I think that raises some valuable questions.
Because we're also talking about how much disturbance do we carry out in nature as hunters. So we also have to weigh the dilemma between effectiveness and nature, and we have to ask ourselves, if we don't use the newest developments, the newest innovations, is it really ethical? Should we return to flashlights or high transmission scopes and then accept that we might have worse shot placement? So that in consequence would mean that there is more suffering on the wildlife side. You probably see what I want to get to. I want to get to that film that it's all about how you use technology. You can abuse it, you can have misconduct, you can be guided by greed, but if you use it responsibly, you can actually increase both sustainability and ethics. So let's break that down to practice in the context of thermal optics. And as thermal optics are either used parallel to or even on top of a firearm, we need to start with the 4 basic rules of firearm safety, which everybody who is here should actually know, because this is all about hunting and arms and optics and everything. So we treat every gun as if it is loaded. Yeah, check. Number two, only point the muzzle at what you want to shoot. And there we're right at it with the thermal optics or night vision optics or scopes in general. We only want to point our muzzle at something that we intend to shoot. So we must be sure that whatever we point the muzzle to is actually something that we intend to shoot. How would we do that if we cannot identify it? So from that stance, from safety rule number 2, it is clearly not ethical to do any hunting at all, daytime, nighttime. They're not able to identify your targets. Number 3, keep the guns on safe and keep fingers straight off the trigger until you intend to shoot. Yes, absolutely. And during all that time, that's a process running through your head, right? Obviously, you want to make sure of what you see is what you want to shoot. And number 4, be aware of your target and what's around it. Do I have backstop? Are there other animals like around the creature? Because the bullet can be deflected. It can have ricochets. A bullet passes through the body of wildlife. And that is very dangerous. We risk to harm other animals. In the worst case, we risk to harm other humans. So thermals actually allow us to act much safer out there because it allows us to see the whole scene, right? We see things with thermal, we see heat sources, we see life, even though it is pitch black. In that respect, that is even better than traditional night vision, right? So it also means that this identification and clear sight of the target means that we can have a better shot placement, which means less suffering. And when that stands, I think it is clear that we are obliged to do everything we can to have the best possible means of both identification and shot placement. And from dusk to dawn, we only can do that if we use technology. Just our eyes don't really afford us that possibility. That in consequence means, on the other hand, and that's where the manufacturers come in, right? That means reliable products that live up to the standards that we want to fulfill. We do not want to experiment on a living creature. We want to rely on it. That means the devices need to stand weather, they need to stand abuse, they need to stand, heavy handling, and we want to be able to do a secure identification under adverse real-world conditions. So, all these ethics and sustainability is not only a question of how we conduct ourselves, but certainly also which technology do we have access to. We need to trust the manufacturers to produce according to circuit standards that meet these requirements. Because in fact, technology gives us full power, and that consequently should come with more responsibility. At least for the German context, I can say this is something which is also a stronghold in the education of hunters. I run a hunting school, and we stress very much the importance of that responsibility that comes with the privilege of A, being allowed and being able to do hunting, but also B, being able to use that technology. So we integrated all these aspects also into our teaching. On the other hand, it has not yet arrived in the testing. There's the teaching, and then people have to do their tests to pass the hunting exam. And in many cases, the questions about night hunting are either rather thin or non-existent. So that is something that needs to change. We need to learn how to limit ourselves. This is very much about humility and modesty. This is not about showing off, right? This is about developing in-depth knowledge, relearn your craft in a new environment, because the night is not our natural habitat, right? We need to develop totally new skills, estimating range, understanding how technology works. For example, what can I see, what can I not see? But it also requires intelligent lawmaking and development. So for example, if you legalize traditional night vision, but you don't legalize infrared flashlights on the gun, there's a break in the logic. That doesn't work, right? On the other hand, if you have technology with thermal, you don't need an extra light, but we all know, like for example, in the German context, we can use handhelds, we can use clip-ons, but we're not allowed to use ghosts, even though it's the same function, but less moving parts, less sourceful error. So there's some full regulation, and the lawmaking need to catch up, just as the basically proof of learning when the hunting exam also was signature. So that also means not everything that's possible also makes sense, right? the solutions that need to be developed by manufacturing side need to be focused on the actual problems in the field. So what I'm saying is the development innovation should be purpose-driven. That means it should be actually done by actual hunting or whatever the mission is requirements. Only then can you develop meaningful features, meaningful technology. So all this in the end of the day, and I want to stress that a lot, it means that with all the new possibilities, the demands for more responsibility is growing, right? And we need to ask ourselves the questions now that we introduce not only thermal, what about LRF, laser range finding, distance? Does that help us to make it modest and limit our shooting distance, or does it encourage us to take risky shots at home distance? And what about ballistic calculators? Do we really understand how they work? Because if we don't, they might give us the illusion that we can shoot like 400 meters, and it doesn't work if we don't have the right data, if we don't understand what's going on there. And the question that obviously is there because it changes our everyday life, what about artificial intelligence? How can it help us? Can it help us? Or does it seduce us to think less, which is something that I see very, very critical in the context of hunting, because we need our own thinking. We need to be out there when we're in the field, that we need to be aware. We cannot delegate our rigid thinking to a machine which might work or not. All right. In conclusion and discussion, and I hope you might have some questions or comments or whatever. This is why I kept this short and quick. In conclusion and discussion, innovation always been changed, not only in the possibilities, but also for us. How do we behave? How do we use it, right? How do we teach it? And it means that we have to go through this change and do this learning again and again and again. As soon as there's something new, we need to learn. We need to go to the bottom of it. And that means as a society, as humans, as manufacturers, as hunters, everybody who's involved in this game needs to learn. And if we use new technology responsible, and as hunters, that should be our own goal, then it means we can increase and improve the level of ethics and sustainability in night hunting. Day hunting too? I don't know. Maybe. We certainly can increase safety in the field, which is a major issue, I think, which is very, very important. We can have better awareness and understanding of wildlife because suddenly we can see and study what we could not see up to that point of time, or we had night vision. And it can increase effectiveness and quality in hunting while reducing stress and disturbance. Why that? Often critics say, you know what? When you got the technology, there's so much disturbance out there because everybody's running crisscross through the fields and I don't know what. Well, people who do that obviously don't know their business. They don't know their craft, right? Because actually, the thermal allows us to spot the animals before we see them, which means we can choose another way to the high scene, or we can basically choose a completely different high scene and lower the disturbance. That technology allows us to limit the effects that create stress for wildlife, which creates crop damage.
And of course, that requires learning. And learning means starting over again and again. Yeah, I thank you for your attention so far. That were the discussions. Is there anybody who has any questions about this? Any comments? Oh, there's someone. Yes, please. Yeah. First row.
How are you? Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Hi, my name's Graham Downing. I've been hunting with thermal in the UK for about 4 or 5 years now. I use a thermal spotter and I use a clip-on.
Yes.
And I am shooting 3 or 4 times the number of deer that I used to shoot when I was using optical sights. And it's a much more effective way. And I hunt on foot. I no longer use high seats regularly because hunting on foot is more effective. There is a difference though, and that is the experience of hunting.
Absolutely.
And when I am hunting with thermal, the hunting experience is different. I am observing nature through effectively a miniature television screen.
Yes.
Instead of smelling the air, breathing the scent of the pine woods, hearing the birds. It is not so much of a natural experience. It's a more technical experience, and it is very different to how I used to hunt maybe 10 years ago. It's much more effective if I want to kill deer, and that's my objective. If I want to kill deer, it's much, much more effective. But the experience is very different. I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Yes. First of all, I agree 100%. It is not what I remember and permanently rewive for myself too. This hunting romantic, this intense experience of nature, totally true, right? So when it comes to the normal hunting, take in the surplus for food, where there is no need to have a limiting factor on the population, for example. I deliberately choose to hunt without, right? I mean, there's no obligation to use technology, and in certain cases it's also not necessary. But if we're talking about severe economic damage, crop protection, for example, if we are talking about keeping away pandemics like African swine disease, right? We are also obliged to be that regulative force out there in nature. So that is another mission, if you want. So that's another task. And the question is then, how can we, in the best possible way, and most ethical way, fulfill that message? Because if we still need to, decrease the population in number, we don't want to do that at any cost. We want to shoot the right animals, right? We don't want to shoot like the doe instead of the calf and then have a suffering calf being alone out there, right? So it's an ambiguity which for me is part of our responsibility to take care of that, not forget the craft of hunting with all the wonderful experiences that you described. But when it's needed, make the best possible choice to increase the values that we connect with hunting, which is a humane shot, humane killing, and fulfilling our task in the best possible way. So it is many sides, many facets, if you like, of one fantastic activity. Is that okay for you? Yeah? All right. Do we have more questions or comments?
Don't be shy, take your chance.
Okay, then I thank you very much. I hope that was interesting for you, and I hope you have a nice trade show. Enjoy the show. There's many interesting products to look at, and you're welcome at our booth if you want to test out the products I was just talking about. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Also from my side.